Welcome back to the afternoon session of World Archery's Elite Coaching Seminar 2020. We've got two presentations left. First up, World Archery Secretary General Tom Dillon gives a guide to anti-doping for coaches. And in case you've forgotten, you can email your questions to us at info@archery.sport or on Twitter using the hashtag Archery Coaching Seminar.
Welcome to the World Archery Coaches Seminar. I'm Tom Dillon. I'm the Secretary General of World Archery. And I wish you a nice welcome to the session on keeping our sport clean. So the topics I will address during this presentation are: is doping an issue in archery? What is the role of the coach in clean sport? Changes to the 2021 World Anti-Doping Code, some concrete examples, and then the last topic will be about alcohol. First, some terminology you need to know as every coach in the world. WADA means the World Anti-Doping Agency, which was created in the late 90s to fight across the world against doping. This is the International Testing Agency, ITA, not to be confused with Italy. NADO, which is the National Anti-Doping Organization, and Therapeutic Use Exemption, which I will cover later on as well, also called TUE. Now, is doping an issue in archery? In 2017, we took 822 samples in archery across the world. This is World Archery, ITA, and everyone else in the world. As a result, there were 3 cases of diuretics and 3 cases of beta blockers. All of them were at national level. In 2018, 1,072 samples were taken worldwide, and there were 4 adverse analytical findings. An adverse analytical finding does not mean that there is a sanction or that there is an anti-doping rule violation. It means a substance was found in the urine. So it's 0.4%. In 2018, and I'll come back to that later, there was the winner of the Las Vegas shoot, testing positive for 2 substances, cannabinoids and beta blockers. In 1 case of anabolic steroids, there was no sanction because it was a contamination case, meaning the person ate meat that contained anabolic steroids and was able to prove such a thing. And there was 1 case of diuretics, no sanction. It was a therapeutic use exemption case. The athlete was allowed to use the diuretics concerned. In 2019, and these are just the International Testing Agency related tests because we don't have the statistics yet for 2019, 234 samples were collected both in and out of competition during our testing program. Out of the 80 out of competition tests coordinated by the ITA, 10% were unsuccessful. This is very much the average across sports, and it's around 10%. So it means they went to go to the athlete's home or training facility and couldn't find him because the athlete forgot to update his whereabouts. The ITA coordinated testing at 14 World Archery events and collected 152 urine samples in competition. One exception was World Cup in Berlin, where it was coordinated by the National Anti-Doping Agency of Germany, who collected the 10 samples. We saw that there was 459 cases where the steroid notifications were generated by the system, and there were 86 atypical notifications. That doesn't mean there is doping, it's just that there was a specific steroid profile that needed further investigation, and in 1 case, an IRMS analysis was requested, but it didn't result in a positive case. These are the details of the different events and the number of tests per event, and of course you can see that at the World Archery Championships in Sekrogodos, most samples were collected because it was also, of course, the main qualifier for the Olympic Games. Therapeutic use exemptions. What is this all about? Well, an athlete is a human being, and so he needs from time to time medication. Now, if the medication is part of the banned list, we need to find a solution. And the solution is a therapeutic use exemption, which allows an athlete to take banned substances under certain conditions. The number one condition is that it cannot enhance his performance. It can only bring it back to what it should have been if he didn't need the medication. You can see here on this chart that there is a clear difference between countries in terms of request. This is very much linked also to the culture of the medical profession in those countries, and in certain countries more medication is prescribed than in others. It doesn't mean that there is any abuse of the system, it's just a question of how it works. Also, we can say that in certain countries, the education of the athletes is better, and therefore they're more aware of the system and they don't have accidental positives. So if you need a medication, number one thing is check with the doctor and make sure it's not on the banned list. Okay, now let's come to the role of the coach, because that's what we're talking about today. What might encourage athletes to use doping? This is something that has been researched over the last few years, and we see the following things. Media coverage. In their attempt to sell newspapers and other promotional material, the media needs to give extensive coverage to doping scandals within sport. This may give the false perception that you need to take doping to be successful. The other one is peer pressure. Athletes may directly observe or hear the practice of fellow athletes who use performance-enhancing drugs. Not necessarily in archery, but we are aware that in other sports this is the case. And therefore, athletes may be offered performance-enhancing drugs by their fellow competitors or team members. The support team pressure. Those people who support athletes, such as family members, coaches, healthcare professionals, may instill additional pressure on athletes to improve performance by any means available. Availability of substances. It's clear that on top of the traditional sources of drug supply, an athlete can now obtain virtually any product they wish through the internet. I will come back to that with an example later on. Misleading information. Some apparently safe supplements may contain traces of prohibited substances in addition. The labeling of supplements may not be complete or accurate, and do you really need supplements? And the last is lack of understanding. Athletes are not pharmacologists, and there is all kinds of information on the label of medication, and sometimes it can be confusing. So, in short, there are many reasons. You as coach don't want to be one of them. What is not the role of a coach? You're not a doctor. You're not there to give medication to athletes. You're not there to hide things. And you're also not a specialist in nutrition and provide food supplements. So what is the role of the coach? Well, you have to make athletes aware of the values of sport. That goes beyond doping. What doping is and why it is harmful. Explain the athletes their responsibilities in the fight against doping. If you're working with high-level athletes, you have to explain them what whereabouts is, because they will probably be on a program where they have to provide their whereabouts so people can be tested out of competition. You have to explain, and this can be at any level, what a therapeutic use exemption is. And last but not least, you have to explain them what strict liability is, meaning if it is found in your body, in your urine, well, then you're liable for it. You can't just say, oh, it happened, or it came from nowhere. There is a strict liability. The athlete is responsible for what is found. And then also important is guide them to the right resources for education, list of banned substances, and there are very good tools to find out what is prohibited and not prohibited. And then last but not least, the therapeutic use exemptions. There is a specific program, for instance, by WADA on the Tokyo Olympics for the ones preparing for the Tokyo Olympics. How to be better informed as a coach? Well, you can reach out to your national federation or the National Anti-Doping Organization to attend a course or workshop. You can also find very good material online, for instance, the online Coach True, which is available in 10 languages, and there is a special anti-doping e-learning platform for the Tokyo 2020 Olympics, available in 3 languages, English, French, and Spanish. And it's also available for athletes. What to tell to the parents? Parents are an important, I would say, part of the life of the athletes, especially young athletes. There is a specific parents' guide to support clean sport developed by WADA. It's available in 7 languages, and we really, I would say, ask you to inform the parents of the people you work with to have a look at it. Here you will find a set of useful links which we will make available after the seminar to all of you, which covers our position on clean sport, therapeutic use exemption, how to do it, what we do with the code from WADA, what is prohibited. We have the Alpha program, we have clean sport guidelines for parents, and the coach through as such. Now, anyway, coach through is a good thing to do if you ever want to follow one of the World Archery coaching programs. You will be asked to provide a certificate that you have done the coach through. So why not already do it and you already have the knowledge? Okay, let's have a look at the changes of the 2021 code. 2021, there will be 10 major changes to the code. Now, some of them are not directly, I would say, relevant for you, but you should be aware that there is a change on the multiple violations rule, so someone who has been caught for doping more than once. There is a clear and a more clear, I would say, description of what happens with prize money and what happens with forfeited prize money. Then there is something important, is that there is less stringent sanctions for protected persons and recreational athletes. A protected person is typically someone who has not yet the capacity to take full responsibility. So we're talking about young minors. It could also be people that have other issues. And then we have recreational athletes. Recreational athletes are athletes that compete for fun, definitely are not part of a high performance program, and therefore at national level there will be a definition of what is a recreational athlete. For protected persons and recreational athletes, sanctions will be less stringent. On the other side of the balance, there is that there will be a reintroduction of aggravating circumstances, and especially when, for instance, a coach or other support personnel is helping or assisting on covering up issues with minors or providing doping to minors. These are aggravating circumstances. There's a clear definition of what the basic rights for an athlete is, both for athletes that are found with an adverse analytical finding, but also for athletes in general. There is a new protection for individuals reporting violations, because it should not be, I would say, dangerous for someone if he sees there is doping taking place and he reports on it. It shouldn't be consequences for the person that is informing on it. Delegation of doping controls, for instance, World Archery delegates doping controls to the International Testing Agency. How decisions are implemented. Prompt and timely admissions on what happens there. So if someone admits immediately that he has taken a substance, there will be, I would say, a way to reduce the sanction. And then last there is a way of addressing the problems of substances of abuse, typical social drugs, and a clear definition of out-of-competition substances. And also there is a clear provision how to handle contaminations and endogenous substances. I talked about contamination earlier on. For instance, we are aware of cases in certain countries where meat is contaminated, and you don't want to end up with a situation that someone is a positive on a doping case just because he went and had a big steak the day before. So, last thing is that there is 2 international standards, one on education and one on result management. Education is important, that everyone addresses education in the same way. Okay, I will give now some concrete examples for people to understand what happens in archery. As I said before, we are not a sport with a high level of doping, but we should be aware that there is possibilities of doping, and I think it's important to understand what type of cases we've had in the past. When I look back at the 2016 Olympics, we had 2 cases linked to the 2016 Olympics. I would say for both, you can say clearly it's very unfortunate it happened. But one case is very unfortunate. It concerns an athlete from El Salvador, and the athlete, I would say, is really the victim of the case. What happened? Well, the day after Oscar Tiquez from El Salvador qualified for the Olympic Games or obtained a place for his country, we got information that a month earlier at another tournament he was tested positive. When we looked into the case, it was clear on what had actually happened. Oscar went to play with some of his teammates football, fell down on a concrete floor, opened his knee. He went to see if he could find the team doctor. The team doctor wasn't available. He saw the physio. Physio said, "Oh, put this on your knee, it will quickly heal." Oscar took the right decision to say, "Okay, are you sure there is nothing banned in this?" Because Oscar was well educated, was aware of the issues with anti-doping, so he asked the physio if it was all okay, and the physio's answer was, "Yes, no problem, we use it in athletics all the time." Oscar put it on, and unfortunately it contained a banned substance. The result of that was that Oscar was sanctioned for a year, which was the absolute minimum we could give, but he also missed the Olympics, and he would have been one of 5 athletes for El Salvador competing at the Olympics. Now Oscar took it well. He's actually one of the persons we have used for education against anti-doping, against doping, sorry. And he is preparing for the 2020 Olympics, which will be in 2021, and we hope that he will make it to the 2021 Olympics. Another case we had in the lead-up of the 2016 Olympics was a clear case of food supplements. Now, why I'm highlighting that case as well is because it also shows what can go wrong afterwards. Now, it was a case of supplements, there's no discussion, contaminated supplements, but then the lawyer of the athlete had the brilliant idea of trying to find other reasons why that happened and base it on eating oranges and coming with all kinds of theories that the whole system was wrong. And the end result of that was that instead of getting probably a 6-month suspension, which would have cost him the Olympics, he ended up with a 2-year ban because of bad legal advice. So this is something to be aware of, is that yes, you're there to help the athlete, but there is a limit as well to where you can go. Case of diuretics. We had a girl from, if I remember correctly, Indonesia, who wanted to lose weight. Not that she was fat, but she wanted to lose weight. And instead of following a proper diet or checking with a nutritionist, she went on the internet and bought products on the internet. And as a result, she got a positive. So, on the internet it was said no side effects. Well, maybe there might have not have been side effects from a medical point of view, but there was definitely a side effect that she got banned. The next case I want to talk about is Vegas 2018. In the Vegas tournament, where there was a lot of money at stake, doping controls were introduced in 2017. And in 2018, the winner of Vegas was found positive. Now, he was found positive on 2 substances. Which is very funny is that when he won, most people were saying, "Oh, he looks very cool." Well, he was very cool probably because he had taken cannabinoids and beta blockers. And he was very cool. But it was also clear that it enhanced his performance, and that's the reason he was banned. He lost his $52,000 prize money, the money he got from his bow manufacturer, and so on. And the sad thing is, of course, is that the runner-up was never able to really celebrate his victory. But it shows the system works. And when I say the system works, it also works in the other sense. In the lead-up of the 2012 Olympics, at a certain moment I was informed by the lab that there was a positive case from an athlete had tested in March. And this was, we got that information a week before the European Championships. Now it concerned an athlete that already had obtained a place for the London Olympic Games. And when I got the information, I was very surprised because I know the athletes, I know his federation, and I know they're very serious about things like that. So I immediately called an expert of a lab and asked if she could provide me details. Now, that expert was based in Canada, and she said, okay, send me the details, and tomorrow when you wake up, you will get the details. So that's what I did. Send her the details. The next morning I wake up, look on my phone, and the answer is, or this lab made the biggest breakthrough in the fight against doping, or this is a false positive. Well, it was a false positive. The athlete never got suspended. The lab got suspended. And also what is very important is that no one ever knew who it was except the athlete, myself, and very few other persons. So the athlete's reputation was never brought into danger, and this is a clear example that the system works. However, it only worked because no one made any stupid declarations. And this is again very important for you as coach to know, is that if you have a positive case of an athlete and he talks to you about it, do not talk with anyone else until it is absolutely finished, because in the lab got suspended. Alcohol. Well, according to the World Anti-Doping Agency, alcohol doesn't fulfill the criteria to be on the banned list. World Archery completely disagrees, because we feel that it fulfills all the criteria to be on the anti-doping list. But it's more a political decision, and we were only ones testing, and we will continue to test. However, the big difference is that it's no longer an anti-doping rule violation, but a sport rule violation. What does that change? Not really a lot. You will still get tests at World Archery competitions for alcohol, still the same way, and if someone is positive, there will still be a sanction, and will be very similar to what would be sanctioned from anti-doping rule violation. Well, I hope you enjoyed this presentation. It's clear that anti-doping is not the most sexy subject of the program. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have questions, you can always contact me or much bigger specialist than me, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the program, and I hope to see you at some event live, not through a camera, in the coming year around the world. All the best for the rest, and see you next time. Bye.
Thank you, Tom. Next up, our final presentation, George. Mitov, the legendary designer of the Eastern X10 Arrow, is here to talk about recurve tuning.
Hi, I'm George Tekvichov. Welcome to our World Archery Recurve Conference discussing tuning, arrows, and a lot more. I hope you'll enjoy the next few minutes as we discuss some of the secrets of getting a tune that's going to help you succeed in our sport.
Today's program will explain why we tune the bow. We'll talk about tuning for the best forgiveness in competition conditions. We'll also talk about the dynamic tuning variables of the recurve bow and how we can manipulate those to optimize our tune. Later, we'll look at arrows, the technology behind arrows, and some history of arrows, as well as the science behind the barreled arrow shaft. The first reason why we want to tune a bow is that we want to win. We want to shoot the very best groups we can shoot. But winning an archery competition takes more than just a tuned bow. It requires an archer who can perform physically and mentally. Tuning is the process of getting the bow, the arrow, and the archer to work equally well together. No two archers can shoot the exact same bow optimally. So tuning also gives you a custom setup that provides for how you release the string, which is an important consideration. We'll look into the reasons behind that. But the steps to win any archery competition are always the same, and there's only two steps. First, score a 10, then do it again. The reason for tuning, of course, is so that we have a much better chance of doing it the second time, the third time, and so on. So, what is tuning? The first thing we have to consider is that tuning is to get everything to work together, the bow, the arrows, and the archer. If we have a perfectly good bow and a very good shooter, but we have arrows that have problems, we cannot get the best performance. So you could say that each element in this triad relationship has equal importance. Now, arrows are one of the most important parts of this bow and arrow system, so let's talk about those in depth for a while. The elements of arrows in order of importance are that they have consistent spine from arrow to arrow, but also 360 degrees around the shaft. What is spine? Well, that is the stiffness of the arrow, and we'll go into detail on that momentarily. We also need to have the knock end of the arrow very straight. Good knock end straightness is really important. Arrow shafts that weigh within plus or minus 2 grains are consistent enough for good competition use. Overall arrow straightness is something that people talk about quite a bit. It's actually not as important as spine, but within 3,000ths or so is going to be okay for competition. Now, we talked about how important spine is, and let's go back into that. What is spine? We'll talk about what that is in a moment, but right now, understand this. A very small spine variation can cost you points on the field of play. If your arrows do not have accurate spine from arrow to arrow, but also 360 degrees around your given arrow, that can cause a loss of points. How do we measure spine? First, we apply an 880-gram weight to the center of the shaft. We support the shaft on centers that are 28 inches apart, as we're about to show now. The amount the shaft bends under the weight is the spine value, and that is expressed in imperial units, specifically inches. Now, there are some special considerations for exactly how you do this measurement. We measure a barrel shaft like an X10 or ECE. We'll address that later in this discussion. When we talk about spine that's measured at the factory, we're really talking about static spine. But when we talk about the spine of the arrow as it's launched by the bow, well, that's different. We're talking about dynamic spine in that instance. The difference between the two is important to understand in order to understand how the bow can create variables that affect the dynamic spine of the arrow. With static spine, we have a load that comes in from the side of the arrow. The direction of the force comes in and deflects the arrow. The arrow is under the stress of a hanging weight, so the force comes in from the side. But when we shoot the arrow, the force comes in differently. Again, static spine, dynamic spine. The push of the string against the inertia of the arrow, and the inertia of the arrow point in particular, creates a column load that generates what we call a dynamic spine deflection. Now, here is why spine is important. The arrow bends as it leaves the bow. The magnitude and the rate of this oscillation are determined by not just the shaft spine, but how it interacts with your finger release. It's important to understand this because it affects clearance as it leaves the bow. Let's look at that one more time. As the fingers release the string, the arrow bends in against the bow, and as it leaves the string, the back of the arrow clears the bow. The front and rear vibration nodes of the arrow are aligned all the way to the target. When the arrow cycles, as you saw in the video just now, we have an arrow that goes from being straight but pointed away from the target to being bent but with its vibration nodes aligned directly with the target. Let's see this again from another angle. As the archer releases, the arrow pushes into the cushion plunger, and then it leaves the bow and fishtails all the way down to the target. It actually creates a vibration that is set up all the way to the target. The consistency of how this arrow cycles depends entirely on consistent spine of the shaft. If another arrow were shot from this exact same bow, but the spine of that arrow were different, the clearance of the vanes as it leaves the bow would also be different. Even the most consistent shooter can't compensate for inconsistent spine. Our basic tuning process uses the bare shaft planing test. This is a very good way to tune the recurve bow with finger release. Paper testing can also be used, but it can give false information with the recurve and should only be used by experts. But the bare shaft test also does depend on consistent shooting ability. The bare shaft tuning method can do a lot. It can help you determine whether you have the correct shaft spine size. It can also determine if you have the correct point weight. Also, because bare shafts are very sensitive to release, it'll tell you whether the shooter is shooting consistently. If you can shoot a group with a bare shaft, that means that you're shooting very consistently. It can help with correcting arrow flight issues that we'll discuss in detail. Some of these are called porpoising and fishtailing. It can also help with potential clearance problems. When we use the bare shaft spine test, we add weight as needed to the rear of the shaft to compensate for the loss of the vane weight. This means that if we remove the vanes to create a bare shaft, we need to add tape or other materials to the back of the arrow that don't affect the aerodynamics of the arrow, but will compensate for the weight change. Sometimes an arrow wrap is enough to do this. Other times you can use masking tape or even duct tape for this purpose, just so long as it weighs the same. The reason that's important is because dynamically, the arrow weight distribution affects the dynamics of the arrow. And so you want to make sure that the weight of the arrow is the same, as well as its balance and distribution of weight. Now, for most accomplished shooters, 30 to 50 meters is best for the bare shaft test. And it's very important to understand that wind variables have a big effect on bare shaft. So it's best to do this test indoors, whenever possible, or in as still conditions as you can find. Now, one of the other things the bare shaft test does for us is it helps us determine whether we have a center shot issue. Center shot is simply having the arrow tip aligned slightly outside the bowstring. As you saw earlier in the high-speed video, the front of the arrow is actually aligned slightly off center, but the nodes of vibration of the arrow are aligned directly with the target. When we set up center shot, we want the arrow tip slightly outside. Obviously, this diagram would be the opposite for a left-handed shooter. The very first thing that we want to do is to check knocking point. That is the most important and first thing to check when we are checking our bow and arrow system. Knocking point height is very important to our tune. We can check for knocking point at short range using a simple piece of paper, shooting along the top edge. If we see a lot of variability and we know that we are releasing well, we know that we may need to make a knocking point adjustment. Remember, always check the knocking point first. If the arrow is too stiff, we'll see a pattern like this, where our bare shafts will be to the left and our fletch shafts will be in the center. And again, this applies to a right-hand shooter. You'll see the opposite pattern if you're left-handed. There are several things we can do to solve an arrow that's too stiff. First, we can increase the point weight. Second, we can increase the bow weight. We can also shoot a lighter string. And we can decrease the knocking point mass. If you're using a brass knock set, a tied-on knock set is lighter and will provide for more energy to go into the arrow, decreasing the problem with an excessively stiff arrow. The most powerful tool, though, is bow weight. You can also use a less stiff knock, as we're about to show you.
Spin wing vanes like these are quite flexible. Other vanes can be quite stiff. The spin wing vane is lighter, other vanes can be heavier. When we're adding weight to the back of the arrow, we have possibly one of the more weight-biased setups on the back of this one. We have a pin knock system, which weighs a bit more than a biter knock. We have an arrow wrap on here that weighs a bit more. And we also have a slightly heavier vane. If we want to lighten the back of the arrow, we have a spin wing vane, which is a light solution. There's no arrow wrap on the back. And we're using a biter in-out knock that doesn't have a pin. The biter in-out knock is one of the lighter options.
We can also use lighter fletching that has less mass, to provide for the same effect. Now, if the arrow is too weak, as shown on this diagram, where we have fletched shafts in the middle and the weak arrows on the right-hand side, again, this will be the opposite for a left-hand shooter, keep that in mind, there are a number of things we can do. But our best tool and our biggest one is going to be to decrease the bow weight. That has an enormous effect. We can make a string that has more strands. For example, you could go from an 18-strand string to a 22-strand string, but you'd also have to change the knock to make sure it fits correctly. We can also use heavier fletching, use an arrow wrap, or we can use heavier knocks. For example, an Easton pin knock with its pin is a heavier option than a biter in-out knock. Finally, we can use stiffer knocks. Stiffer knocks provide for a larger reaction difference. If we have fishtailing, where the arrow is sort of swimming back and forth, we'll see problems with grouping at short range, not necessarily at long range. As you can see in the diagram on the left, the arrow needs time to settle down. The causes of fishtailing can be many. If the shaft is either too weak or too stiff, we may see fishtailing, where the arrow wags back and forth as it leaves the bow. And again, we'll see issues with grouping at close distances. If our point is too heavy and we get a weak shaft reaction, we may see fishtailing. Then again, if the point is too light and the arrow is acting too stiff, we'll get the same result. If our center shot is incorrect, we may see fishtailing as a result of the interaction with the fingers on release. If we have a clearance problem, where part of the arrow is striking the bow on the way out, we will probably see fishtailing, particularly at close range. We can do a short range check, where we shoot at just a few meters, on a side of a piece of paper or a target in order to determine whether we have good consistency at close range. Again, if the shaft is too weak or too stiff, we'll see patterns like this. All these causes can be shown at close range more than at long range. If we have a clearance problem, the first thing to check for is to make sure that our arrow rest is correctly set up on the arrow shaft. On the left, you see an incorrect position set up for an arrow rest where too much of the arrow rest arm is sticking out past the bow. During the cycling of the arrow, as it leaves the bow, the vanes have a very high chance of striking an arrow rest that's sticking out too far. The correct position shows that we're supporting the arrow a little over halfway through its diameter. Rest clearance is a very important characteristic. Another important characteristic is just how much of the arrow shaft sticks out in front of our cushion plunger. Generally, we want to see a recurve setup with not less than 1.5 to 2 centimeters of shaft, not including the back of the point, in front of the plunger at full draw. This is more forgiving of release variations because it puts the front node of the arrow shaft close to the cushion plunger at the moment that the two separate. So keep in mind that you want to have at least 3/4 of an inch, 1.5 to 2 centimeters of shaft, not including the point, in front of the plunger when you're at full draw. Another important factor is just how much tension there is between the nock and the string, and this is very important when we're talking about lighter weight bows, those under 30 pounds. The arrow should separate from the bowstring with just a light tap. If you allow the arrow to hang from the bowstring vertically and you tap the string, it should come off. However, if it falls off under its own weight, it's probably too loose. If you pull on the arrow while it's attached to the string, and it can pull the string more than about 1.5 centimeters without releasing, chances are it's too tight. You may need to reserve the center of the string or go to a bigger diameter knot in order to accommodate whatever size string you have. Earlier we talked about the effects of having issues at short range with grouping. Let's talk about that in more detail. Good grouping patterns, like you see on top, show that we have progressively increasing grouping sizes as our shooting distances increase. We're seeing essentially a linear change as the distance increases. In the middle, though, we see the effects of having too much drag. That is, the arrow has too much aerodynamic drag because maybe the fletching, it has too much large area on it, too big, and it flutters perhaps. Maybe it's not stiff enough. And so at 30 and 50 meters, we'll see great groups. However, at 70 meters, we may see groups that are bigger. At 90 meters, which isn't shot much anymore, but is a great acid test for this kind of thing, we will see our groups open up considerably. Now, in lighter weight bows, you'll see changes like this at closer distances, 70 meters, for example, even at 50 in some cases. We talked about insufficient clearance before. The kind of grouping you can expect to see when you have clearance problems is, as shown in the diagram, 30 meters might be a problem, 50 meters not so great, but 70 and 90 don't get affected quite as much. Again, going back to the issue of clearance, where our groups at 30 and 50 meters are not what we want, we can solve this a number of ways. Obviously, we want to check to make sure that our rest and also our clicker are clearing the arrow on release. The way we do this is we can take some powder, such as spray powder that's used for foot powder, that kind of thing, spray it on the area of the bow shelf as well as on the back of the arrow. Then when we shoot into a hard target material, we can look carefully at the back of the arrow and also at the shelf of the bow, and it'll leave a telltale mark if there's a clearance problem. You can also put lipstick on a vane to see if the vane leaves a mark on your bow. When you see a clearance problem, you need to make sure you have the correct spine, but you also need to make sure the nock fits correctly on the string. We'll also look at a fine-tuning process that can help solve insufficient clearance later on. If we have too much drag and our groups are getting bigger at longer distance, then there are a number of things that we need to look at. We could increase the point weight or use a heavier arrow shaft, one that has more mass, to maintain more downrange velocity. We could make our bow heavier and shoot increased bow velocity, but those things are very difficult to do, particularly during a training cycle. So the best thing to look at is possibly a smaller vane. If we're using a large vane and the vane has a lot of drag on it, it may be too much drag for the amount of mass that our arrow has, and downrange we may see groups open up. So a smaller vane can help with this. If our vane has been put on with a large angle of incidence, we may want to decrease the vane angle to reduce the amount of drag. And finally, if our vane is made of a material that is very soft and has a tendency to flutter while in flight, we may use a stiffer vane material, which will decrease drag as well. Vanes that flutter generate more drag. Brace height is a critical part of our setup. On recurve bows in particular, brace height affects many things. Sometimes, though, we may find that we need to make changes to brace height based on small changes that involve things like how the nock fits, or whether we're using a heavier arrow, or whether we're using a heavier string. Bow manufacturers give you guidelines for brace height, but we might need to make adjustments to those outside of manufacturer guidelines like these. This is a typical chart that you'll see from a manufacturer for bow lengths. And as you can see, it gives you a range that may work for the bow made by that particular manufacturer. For example, a 68-inch bow may use an 8.5 to an 8 3/4 inch brace height in order to start. But remember, this is only a starting point. Many archers, for example, who use a 68-inch bow, who are shooting competitive bow weight, and who are using X10 arrows, are using closer to a 9-inch bow weight, 8 7/8 of an inch, for example. So remember, the guidelines from the manufacturer are a starting point. How do we make a brace height adjustment? Well, obviously, the easiest and fastest way to do this is to increase the number of twists in your string to increase brace height. If you have enough twists available, you can decrease twists in order to decrease brace height. A good rule of thumb is to try not to go over 1 twist per inch of bow length. If you have more twists in your string, the string will become more elastic and you may lose speed. However, you may also have issues with bows that have too many twists in the string from the standpoint of simple storage of the string. It may become tangled very easily if you have too many twists. So again, try not to go over 1 twist per inch of bow length. Now, it's true that many top shooters have used many more twists than this, and some have used many less. This is a guideline. Remember also that when you increase brace height, you increase the preload on the limbs, which will cause a weaker shaft reaction on launch because it has slightly more weight at the moment of release. However, because the follow-through of the string is shorter, you may get less cast overall. In other words, your long-distance sight marks may change. They may go lower. If you have lower brace height, you may be able to get sight marks that work better, but you'll increase the chance of clearance issues. If the string and arrow follow through too long, the arrow may not have time to bend far enough so that the back of the arrow doesn't hit the bow. So remember, there are trade-offs. Higher brace height will produce less cast potentially, give you better clearance. Lower brace height will give you better cast, but may increase the chance of clearance issues. While we're on the subject of arrows, let's talk a little bit about the history of the modern competition target shaft. It was back in 1947 when a California shooter named Larry Hughes won the USA Nationals with aluminum arrows that were made by Doug Easton. Doug Easton started making arrows in 1922. Back then, arrows were made of wood. Wooden arrows of the day were very expensive and intricately made, as we're about to look at. The advent of the aluminum arrow made an enormous difference in archery worldwide. Doug Easton spent many hours in his workshop building those original wood arrows. But when he discovered a way to make arrows using aluminum, his business expanded and became very popular. Hollywood stars started getting into archery because the availability of arrows was much greater once the aluminum arrow came into play. Jim Easton, who would go on to become president of FITA and then later World Archery, is seeing his roots very much so in the family business. At the time he was a teenager, Jim Easton was working every day at the Easton Archery Shop in Los Angeles. And also, he was a competitive shooter. By the 1950s, the Easton Company expanded to build a factory on Khalifa Avenue in Los Angeles, California. This allowed for a lot more production. By the late 1960s, a larger new factory was built on Haskell Avenue in Van Nuys, California. Doug Easton, by this point, was still working every day in the factory. Hollywood stars continued to enjoy archery, like these stars of Star Trek. In the 1980s, Easton expanded its operations to Salt Lake City, Utah, and this factory. And also San Diego, California, where most carbon arrows originated. Carbon arrows made a big difference in the sport of archery. The first time carbon fiber was available to sporting goods and consumer markets took place around 1969, when Jim Easton made an investment to facilitate further development by an early maker of what was then an exotic material. And in 1971, Jim Easton created the first carbon fiber arrow shafts. These early arrows were brittle and difficult to make straight and consistent. But then Easton started working on a better method to build a carbon shaft that could be straightened to better tolerances and survive impact with hard target butts. This led to the successful construction of the first AC arrow shafts in 1983. With the release of the first AC arrow shafts, gold medalist Darrell Pace of the United States of America used them in both the 1983 World Championship and the 1984 Olympic Games. In 1987, Easton developed the ACE, which was the first barreled AC arrow. Jay Bars won the Olympic Games with the new ACE arrow shaft. In 1992, a prototype of today's X10 arrow was used in the 1992 Games in Barcelona. The X10 was developed and released in late 1995 in preparation for the Atlanta Olympic Games, which were won by Justin Hewish with the Easton X10. The X10 also won every other medal at those particular games. Through 2016's Olympic Games in Rio, every individual Olympic men's and women's gold medalist won with the X10. And every team title was also taken with the X10. All major outdoor target recurve world records set since 1996, and all Olympic titles of both men's and women's, individual and team, were accomplished using X10s. X10s, as well as other high-end arrows, are made with carbon fiber. Carbon fiber is a less consistent material than aluminum. In engineering terms, we say that the specific stiffness of the material, that is the ratio of its stiffness to its mass weight, is lower with aluminum, higher with carbon. But aluminum has extreme consistency in terms of this stiffness, while even the highest grade carbon fibers have a lack of consistency compared to aluminum. So there is a workaround needed to ensure that you have really good spine properties with carbon arrow. Easton uses weight codes as one of these workarounds. Let's talk about what a weight code is. You can't have perfect spine and perfect weight consistency with any carbon fiber arrow shafts. You have to compromise somewhere. Either you compromise on spine or you compromise on weight. Now, it is much better for every arrow in a given model to have the exact same spine, and easier for end users to segregate their shafts by mass weight than by spine because, frankly, most people don't have a spine tester. Easton groups its high-end shaft production runs by weight and then makes the spine extremely accurate. There are other variables that affect weight codes or the mass weight of a carbon arrow and also affect its spine. Easton's approach of weight sorting and spine sorting carbon fiber shafts allow it to have the same consistency as aluminum. Easton also minimizes the weight codes by improving its processes and working with its material suppliers without compromising the tunability of shaft models over time. Now, a weight code on an ECE and X10 arrow shaft covers a total spread of 1.5 grains, a very small tolerance. But packaged shafts within a dozen are held at an even tighter tolerance of plus or minus half a grain. That means it's easily possible to mix shafts from two adjacent weight codes. For example, a C2 and a C3 can be mixed with no problem. Earlier, we talked about arrows like the X10 and ACE being barreled. Among other things, this provides for aerodynamic advantage, but the biggest advantage is that it improves clearance with finger release, and it also makes the shaft more forgiving for slight inconsistencies in finger release, because the more flexible rear of the arrow acts a bit like a shock absorber. However, when setting up the bow with a barreled arrow, there are a few things to keep in mind. Let's take a closer look at the barreled arrow. This diagram shows the engineering drawing for an X10 arrow shaft. All the different models have different specific custom spines, as well as tapers for the knock end, for the center, and for the front end. These custom setups are the same for each size of X10, but are different from one size X10 to another. But something you'll notice right away when you look at the back of the arrow is that if you were to cut from the back of the arrow on the left-hand side of the drawing, you would actually be able to change the stiffness of the arrow shaft. If you were to cut, say, 1 centimeter off the back of the arrow, you would make the arrow stiffer. A small change to the knock end on an X10 can have a big effect on the overall shaft spine reaction. However, it won't be the same change from one archer to another because of variables in finger release. Top archers sometimes, but generally not necessarily, will make small adjustments to the back of the arrow to get a custom tune. The reason that if you call Easton and ask them, how much should I cut from the back of my arrow, they'll tell you that they cannot give you a specific answer, is because it involves the interaction between how you shoot your fingers and the back of the arrow. The more you cut from the back of the shaft, the more it will stiffen. However, if you cut too far, the shaft can become less forgiving. So, guidelines when making tuning adjustments: if you decide that you do want to change the factory cut on the back of an X10, make sure you leave it long in front so that you have enough adjustment. When adjusting the knock end of the shaft, you should only trim a small amount, 4 millimeters at a time, because the stiffness will change very rapidly past a certain point, and that point varies with every user and their individual finger release. Another trick to understand about barreled shafts like the X10 is that because of the size of the barrel, if you have an X10 shaft stiffer than about a 550 spine, you should run it closer to the middle in terms of the reference to your center shot. Come in a little closer to the middle than what the textbook would show. Arrows have issues from time to time. Some of these issues involve things like how straight they may be after use, or how straight the knock may be after being impacted. Is the knock set correctly in terms of its index to the vein? We may see clearance problems if our knock has rotated. If our points are loose or damaged, we may have a problem. If our fletching is loose or damaged, we may also have a problem. Now, consider something like a spin wing vane, which is a flexible vane. If it has a crease or some other small damage, odds are it will still group just fine. But let's say you're shooting a hard vane, something like a flowknife vane. If the back of that flowknife vane is damaged, you may see a big change in where the arrow impacts. Needless to say, a loose vein can be a disaster. If the arrow shaft is damaged, for example, by being hit by another arrow, let's say there's a crack or a dent in an aluminum arrow, that can also create issues in terms of how the arrow groups, and it can even be dangerous on release. Let's say that you have a set of arrows and you use 6 of the arrows in a really hard target material, ceramic, for example, and the other 6 you reserve for double-A events where you shoot into foam targets. You'll see a lot of wear and tear on the front of that carbon arrow. It will actually remove weight over the course of the season, a few grains, but enough that it will affect the different shot between the practice arrows and the ones you use for competition. To keep the weight consistent on your arrows, if you're shooting into hard target materials, be sure that you keep rotating the arrows in use.
When we're checking arrows, sometimes you'll see a lot of archers coming back from the target doing this. What we're really looking for is there any wobble in the knock end of the arrow? Everything's fine on this one.
Another important area is componentry, and in particular, your points. Loose points in your arrows might make you lose points on your scorecard. There's an easy test to make sure your points aren't vibrating and causing the arrow to vibrate differently. Simply hold the arrow near the fletching and lightly tap the point on a table, or I like this method.
That one has a loose point.
So if you hear a buzzing sound, the point insert is probably loose. Go ahead and heat up and pull out the point insert and properly reinstall with good quality hot melt glue. The fine-tuning process is an important part of getting the most from your equipment. Fine-tuning processes start with documentation. You need to write down the exact measurements of your bow, your knocking point height, your brace height, tiller of the bow, the difference between the top limb to the string and bottom limb to the string distance, the number of strands in your bowstring, your draw weight measured with an accurate scale. What kind of stabilizers are you using? Any kind of accessory items on the bow will affect its dynamic reaction and can affect the tune. Another important step in the fine-tuning process is to put an individual number on all of your arrows. This will let you plot your groups and plot each individual arrow impact on your plotting chart. You want to shoot from a comfortable distance. Somewhere between 40 to 60 meters is a good choice. When fine-tuning, before you start, make sure you warm up before you begin. After you've warmed up, shoot a group of 6 to 10 fletched arrows with your baseline setup. We then plot the number of each arrow on a plotting chart and look at its impact point on our target sample. We repeat those steps until we see any differences with the changes that we're going to make to the system coming up in our next look. What are some of these changes? Well, the first one is the knocking point. When we're fine-tuning, we want to micro-adjust the knocking point in order to find the point at which it provides for the best group. The first thing we do is move the knocking point up, because usually a higher knocking point is more forgiving. So we'll move the knocking point up by 1 millimeter. Then we'll go ahead and shoot as we described. We'll shoot several groups, plotting the result. We'll write down the amount of the adjustment and make sure that we associate that with the plots for that particular change. Now, let's say we saw an improvement. If we do, we'll move it another millimeter and then repeat. Once we see grouping start to open up, we stop and go back to the 0 point, our original documented knocking point position, and work it from the other direction. We'll move the knocking point down a millimeter at a time until we see where we get the best groups. Sometimes a slightly lower knocking point will provide a better group, so this is a good process to follow. Once you've done this, then make sure that you establish where your bear shaft setting is with respect to the new knocking point, and keep a note of that, because that will be your individual tuning mark. You can always recheck your tune quickly and easily by shooting bear shaft at your given distance and checking it against your tuning mark. For left and right impact, we can adjust cushion plunger pressure with small increments. Again, very important to take notes. When you start, and one of the best ways to start is using a biter plunger that has the number indices on it so you can see exactly where your setting is. You'll want to take notes of exactly where you start with. First, make sure that you look for arrows that don't group well with the others. Perhaps they have some damage to the nock or some other factor that may make them not group as well. So be sure that you're looking at your groups, not individual arrows so much. If you have a flyer, make sure that you understand the reason why. Check for damage, check for bending, check for those kinds of factors. Remember to always install every accessory on your bow as you intend to use it. If you change a major accessory, and I count sights and stabilizers in this, you really need to recheck your final tune. A stabilizer change in particular, or a change to the mass weights on your stabilizer, can definitely affect your tune. It's really essential to have good quality arrows and nocks that are in the best condition when doing the fine tune. Fresh nocks are a good idea before starting the fine-tuning process. If you make any changes to your form, to your draw length, to how you grip the string, to how you put your hand in the bow, you may find that your fine-tune changes, and then you'll need to recheck it according to the process that we just described.
I'm George Tekmanchuk. I want to thank you for joining us for this brief discussion of arrow tuning, bow tuning, and for being part of our World Archery family during these trying times. It's just something to look forward to when we can all get back together again on the field of play, and I'll look forward to seeing you all out there soon. Thanks for joining us.
Fascinating insight. Thank you, George. Well, that's it for today's lectures, but you've still got a chance to send us through your questions. You can email them to us at info@archery.sport or send them on Twitter using the hashtag archerycoaching